Welcome to today's event. I'm Corey Swans with the John Locke Foundation. Pleased to have you all here today. Today we are putting on an event in celebration of Milton Friedman's birthday. He would have been 99 years old today. And I want to thank the Milton Friedman Foundation for their support of these activities. There are luncheons and events going around the world today in celebration of Milton Friedman's birthday. And briefly, I also wanted to introduce to you Max, who is going to tell us a bit more about another Friedman celebration that's going on all year through 2012. Max is editor of the Free to Choose Network. So come on up and tell us a bit.
Thanks. I just got lucky, I guess, but it's a perfect time to describe the centennial celebration for 2012 of Milton Friedman and his. He would have been 100 years old. It's a really important year, as you know, and we want to basically make this a Free to Choose Network is trying to essentially catalyze organizations all around the liberty movement to do something, blog, write an op-ed. Just do something to commemorate the man and his ideas, the man who embodied a movement, because not only is this an important year, but it's a perfect time to celebrate Milton Friedman's life. So I encourage all the organizations represented in this room and individuals and clubs even to do something next year for Milton Friedman's century. And please feel free to get in touch with me at Free to Choose, and I can set that up. We'll put you on the calendar. And as many organizations we can get, we'll be happy. Oh yeah, MiltonFriedmansCentury.org. Obviously there's no apostrophe there, but you get the idea. You can also find it through freetochoose.net. And I'm at max.borders@freetochoose.net.
Great. Thank you, Max. Appreciate it. Well, today's lecture is our own Dr. Roy Cordato, who's Vice President of Research and Resident Scholar at the John Locke Foundation. From 1993 through 2000, Roy served as a Lundy Professor of Business Philosophy at Campbell University in Buies Creek, North Carolina. And from 1987 to 1993, he was Senior Economist at the Institute for Research on the Economics of Taxation in Washington, D.C. He's served as a full-time economics faculty at the University of Hartford and at Auburn University, and as an adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins University. His publications include his 1992 book, Welfare Economics and Externalities in an Open-Ended Universe, and which was republished in 2007 by the Ludwig von Mises Institute. His articles have appeared in a number of economics journals and law reviews, including the Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Times, Investor's Business Daily, the Journal of Commerce, the Congressional Record, and many more. In 2000, he received the Freedom Foundation's Levy Award in Free Enterprise Education. He is also a member of the Mount Pearland Society and a former executive board member of the Association of Private Enterprise Education. Roy holds his M.A. in Urban and Regional Economics from the University of Hartford and a Ph.D. in Economics from George Mason University. He also holds a Bachelor of Music Education from the Hart School of Music. And one of the interesting things about Roy is an exceptionally talented musician as well, a bass player, a jazz player, who studied with one of the jazz greats, bass players, Eddie Gomez. And so Roy brings a number of talents. So does Karen, his wife, as a matter of fact. So, Roy, please come on up.
Thanks, Corey. First thing I have to ask is who is actually eating both the cake and the cookie? Wow. That is wrong. I'm sorry. Okay. Am I audible? Very good. By the way, I mentioned I'm a member of the Mount Pelerin Society. Of course, Milton Friedman was a founder of the Mount Pelerin Society, so I'm very proud of that. Notice I got a stack of books here next to me. I'm going to be reading some quotes. My talk is about Milton Friedman's theories regarding the social responsibility of business. And when I decided I wanted to do this talk a few months ago. I went to Corey and said, I'd like to do this year's talk, and here's what I do it on. He said, oh, perfect, you are the shortest person at the John Locke Foundation, the one who meets the stature most closely of Milton Friedman. No, he did not say that. He said that would be fine, and I had it in mind exactly what I was going to do, because I actually teach this in a class that I teach currently at NC State. But interestingly enough, my teaching of it doesn't go as deep as I now think it should. And I guess I have to warn everyone that I am going to be somewhat critical of Friedman in this talk, which people who hear me talk know that I'm always critical of somebody when I talk. Like Groucho Marx said, whatever it is, I'm against it. So, just a warning. Well, in 1962, and then again in 1970, Milton Friedman wrote 2 short essays reacting to the idea that business had a special obligation to society beyond pursuing profits and providing goods and services for their customers. The first was this short section, 3-page section. This was in 1962 in Capitalism and Freedom, which was titled The Social Responsibility of Business and Labor. And the second, in 1970, was a standalone article that appeared in the New York Times Magazine and called The Social Responsibility of Businesses to Increase Profits. And it was this second piece which really put this issue on the map and gave Friedman's view a lot of notoriety, probably because of the venue, New York Times Magazine. And it actually launched a big debate on the subject that was in business journals and so on. And to understand where Friedman was coming from and what he was reacting against, we need first, I think, to focus our attention on what might be called the standard social responsibility view. And interestingly enough, to explain what that is, I'm actually going to turn to John Hood, who wrote this really good book called The Heroic Enterprise, which is in large part about Friedman's view of social responsibility of business. And he has a lot of case studies in here. And I've used it when I taught in the MBA program at NC Campbell. This was a required text in one of my classes. And I currently violate all kinds of copyright laws by copying some pages of it and handing it out to my class at State right now. I thought you were taking it out of my salary. I assumed that's why it was so low. Here's how John explains the standard social responsibility view, and he does a good job here. This is in his book. He says, the gist of the corporate social responsibility thesis is that firms should have responsibilities beyond those of economic self-interest. Instead of having a goal of maximizing return to owners or shareholders, corporate social responsibility advocates say responsible and ethical companies must balance profit-seeking and other social goals. And then he quotes someone named Richard Evans, director of British corporation Tradecraft, saying that ethics, with its concern for the common good of all people and its attempt at a coherent analysis of how this can be achieved, cannot allow business to define itself in purely economic terms and to ignore the ethical implications of its involvement in the lives of individuals and society as a whole in many other areas. And it is this view that is the backdrop for Friedman's writings on this issue. And in 1962, Friedman, in his 1962 Capitalism and Freedom, and this section called Social Responsibility of Business, he says it right up front. His very first sentence echoes what Hood just said. He said, the view has been gaining widespread acceptance that corporate officials and labor leaders have a social responsibility that goes beyond serving the interests of their shareholders or their members. This view shows a fundamental misconception of the character and nature of a free economy. In such an economy, there is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engage in open and free competition without deception or fraud. That last section I'm going to come back to at the end of the talk. It's very important. Now, so what we have here is two very different views of the social responsibility of business. And one is that businesses should essentially give away its profits. That's the socially responsible thing to do, or at least some portion of its profits, being the standard view. And the other, Friedman's view, essentially saying that no, that businesses should pursue profit for the benefit of its shareholders, not necessarily for the benefit of society. Now, this difference in perspective ultimately emerges from alternative theories of business profit. And both are a product of 18th and 19th century classical economics. In particular, the first of the really influential classicals, Adam Smith, and then the last of the really influential classicals, Karl Marx. Probably no surprise, the standard social responsibility theory is Marxist. And we'll explain why that is. It arises from what is called the labor theory of value. That is, that the value of all goods and services come from the labor that has been put into producing those goods and services. Marxist theory argues that profit is unearned and ultimately results from the exploitation of labor. And I would argue that this is the central idea behind the standard view that standard views that a profitable business must give something back to society. In fact, I would argue this whole idea of that successful people have to give something back to society is ultimately Marxist, because it implies that people have taken something. Right? If you have to give something back, it implies you have taken something. Well, the Marxist theory suggests that profitable people have taken something from workers. And again, I'm going to quote Marx. You probably didn't think I was going to be quoting Marx. This is a great little, by the way, it's a great little pamphlet. I got it years ago. I just discovered the whole thing is on the web. It's called Value, Price, and Profit. It's by Marx. Karl, not Groucho. The latter being my favorite Marx, of course. But I want to read first about the labor theory of value, and then how that implies this particular theory of profit. Quoting Marx, "The value of a commodity is determined by the total quantity of labor contained in it. But part of that quantity of labor is realized in a value for which an equivalent has been paid in the form of wages. And part of it is realized in a value which no equivalent has been paid. Part of the labor contained in the commodity is paid labor, part is unpaid labor. By selling, therefore, the commodity at its value, that is, as the crystallization of the total quantity of labor bestowed upon it, the capitalist must necessarily sell it at a profit." And then Marx goes on to say, "The surplus value, or that part of the total value of the commodity in which the surplus value or unpaid labor of the working man is realized, I call profit. The whole of that profit is not pocketed by the capitalist, but," and he goes on to say, "it's pocketed partly by landowners in the form of rent, and by money lenders in the form of interest." And then he says, "Rent, interest, and industrial profit are only different names for for different parts of the surplus value of the commodity or the unpaid labor realized in it, and they are equally derived from this source and from this source alone. So it all comes from labor. Okay. Now, to bring that up to date, I'm going to go to Hood's book again here. Modern social responsibility theorists, I'm not making this up, they acknowledge their debt to Marx on this theory of value and theory of profit. Again, I go to Hood's book. He quotes somebody whose name I absolutely love, Jerry Mander. What a name. I mean, you just can't beat that name. This is, Jerry Mander wrote a book published by Sierra Club in 1991, so a contemporary book, and on social responsibility of business. And he says, all corporate profit, and compare that to what I just read from Marx, all corporate profit is obtained by a simple formula. Profit equals the difference between the amount paid to an employee and the economic value of the employee's output, and or the difference between the amount paid for raw materials used in the product and the ultimate sales price of the processed raw materials. Karl Marx was right. A worker is not compensated for the full value of his or her labor, neither is the raw material supplier. The owners of capital skim off a part of the value as profit. Profit is based on underpayment. This is called exploitation. Okay, so so here we have it, right? We have a theory of profit which says that profit is the result of taking something, right? Taking something from labor. You've exploited labor. So of course, if you've taken something from society, your workers, you have to give something back. Makes perfect sense. Hence, we get the the standard view of the social responsibility of business. Okay. Obviously, Friedman has a different view of profits, and I suggested there's two pillars of classical economics at work here. I just quoted Marx. The other is Adam Smith. So to understand Friedman's argument, you must understand Smith's view of profits. And Friedman cites Smith in his 1962 Capitalism and Freedom on this. He says, after saying what the responsibility of business is, right, to earn profits, he says, what's the responsibility of the rest of us? Not business, right? He said, it is the responsibility of the rest of us to establish a framework of law such that individuals in pursuing their own interests is, to quote Adam Smith again, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who effect to trade for the public good. Very famous quote from Adam Smith. But the problem is that I think that Friedman kind of leaves it hanging there. He doesn't really explain more about Smith, which I think he needs to do to bring a fuller understanding of what he's getting at when he says the social responsibility of businesses to increase profits. He just sort of, that's it. He's on to it. We need to bring in more of Smith's quote than simply the section that Friedman relies on to get at the Smith-Friedman view of profit. And I'm going to refer to the master himself, Adam Smith. Smith says, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. By directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. The famous invisible hand quote. By the way, that phrase, invisible hand, appears in this whole book, right there and right there only. The most famous thing that come out of this book for people, and it appears once on page 423, in case anyone wants to go and check that out. But the interesting what I want to focus on from that quote is he says, by directing that industry in such a way as its produce may be of greatest value, he intends only his own gain. So notice what the entrepreneur is doing here with Smith. He's directing industry in such a way as its produce is of the greatest value. He's adding value by directing the workers and other resources under his control in a way that it creates the greatest value. Now why? Well, because when he creates the greatest value to others, he also maximizes his own profits. All right? And that's where this is going. He's creating greatest value for himself, right? And in the process, he's creating the greatest value to society. And of course, this comes from the notion of free exchange, right? The way you make yourself better off under voluntary exchange is by providing value to others. The greater the value you provide to others, the more you make yourself better off, whether that's intensively or more extensively. So what essentially Friedman is saying is that in pursuing profit and increasing their profit, they're making society better. The businessman is making society better off. Therefore, it's the social responsibility of business, because he's making society better off while doing it, to increase his profits. I want to raise this question. Does that beg the question? Why is it the social responsibility of business to make society better off? Friedman never answers that question, which I think is kind of a shortfall in both of his essays. I'm going to come back to that question later on, but I'm just throwing that out now. Okay, let's jump ahead 8 years to the New York Times article. That's all basically 1962 stuff. 8 years later, this is the article that everyone remembers, is quoted the most. Although interesting, the thing that's quoted the most from that article is actually him quoting himself from 1962, which is a little bit strange. But the interesting thing is, in this famous New York Times article, Friedman drops the whole Smithian theme. He doesn't even quote Adam Smith, except for saying that he knows no good to come from businessmen who try to pursue the public interest. But he doesn't talk about the nature of profits. He doesn't talk about the invisible hand. None of that is in this famous 1970 article. And in fact, in this paper, despite the title of the paper is The Social Responsibility of Businesses to Increase Profits, there's no defense of this proposition in the 1970 New York Times article. It was not so much a defense of the idea that social responsibility of business is to increase profit, but it was an attack on the whole idea that business, and especially corporations, can be said to have a social responsibility at all, which is kind of strange. What he essentially argues is that, especially when referring to a corporation, a business's responsibility is to its shareholders and not to society. Let me quote from the article. Friedman says, in a free enterprise private property system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. He has direct responsibility to his employers. That responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. I'm going to come back to that section too in a minute. The key point is that in his capacity as a corporate executive, the manager is the agent of the individuals who own the corporation, and his primary responsibility is to them. And this is the theme of that whole article. It's not about a social responsibility at all. In fact, he actually rejects the whole idea in that article. Okay. So I think we have these two pieces, 1962 and 1970. And I think that in many ways there's actually a clash between the two discussions. One can come away from reading the 1970 article, I think, well equipped to explain why the standard social responsibility of business doctrine is illogical, why it's nonsensical. But he will not, despite the title of the article, be able to explain why it is the social responsibility of business to increase profits. Because nowhere in the article does Friedman make the case that the title implies he will be making. I didn't realize that really until I prepared for this talk. I always concentrated on his discussion in Capitalism and Freedom. That's what I talk about in my classes. But I went and read the 1970 article, which isn't really that easy to find. You'd think it would be all over the internet, but it's not. It's actually kind of difficult. And as I said, he doesn't do what the title implies. So where does this leave us? Well, I want to go back to the question I asked earlier. In 1962, Friedman argued that social responsibility of business is to increase profits because, a la Smith, when he does so, he is led to make society better off. But as I asked, why is it the social responsibility of business to make society better off? Well, I want to argue that it isn't. That it's really something else. Friedman, what he does is attempts to make intended what is an unintended consequence of increasing profits when he claims that it is the social responsibility of business to do so. Essentially, Friedman is saying that since making society better off is an unintended consequence of the process of maximizing profits, then businesses have an obligation or responsibility to their fellow man to maximize profits. Now, I'd be happy to entertain a discussion of this, but I think that argument is a non sequitur. If maximizing profit is the social responsibility of business, then why isn't it all of our social responsibility? After all, the Smithian conclusion about the invisible hand is not just about business, but about pursuing one's self-interest in a market context through exchange. Why isn't it all of our responsibility to maximize our own net income? Total income minus costs of gaining that income, which for each of us, business or not, is our profit. Why isn't that each of our social responsibility? Well, Friedman thinks it's not each of our social. He just thinks it's for business. He says that in his papers. He says, as individuals, we can do what we want. But business is separate. Now, on the other hand, I don't want to take Friedman's 1970 position either, that essentially business has no social responsibility, that they have only private responsibilities. So what is the social responsibility of business? Well, I want to turn to what might be called Friedman's proviso, okay, which I read before. And it's from in his 1962 discussion. In fact, I think John uses the word proviso in his book to describe this. He says, there's one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase profits. And here's the proviso: so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engage in open and free competition without deception or fraud. Now, it's a great statement. There is a problem, though. What if the rules of the game include engaging in competition that is not so open or free. Right? We can think of a lot of things that are within the rules of the game that are not about engaging in open and free competition. Rent-seeking activities of all kind, trying to get protective tariffs for your business, trying to get licensing put in place, getting subsidies for your business, special regulations to keep competition out. All of those things are within the rules of the game, but they're not about engaging in open and free competition. And unfortunately, in 1970, Friedman actually muddies the waters even more, where he says the social responsibility of business is to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. I don't even know what to make of that. I mean, that opens the door to all kinds of unopen and unfree competition. Because, I mean, there's all kinds of ethical customs that are not about free competition. I can think of a lot of them, especially as an Italian. My Sons of Italy brothers would punch me in the nose for that remark. Literally. Okay, that said, I'd like to suggest that the actual social responsibility of business is to follow the dictates of what I believe is the least ambiguous aspect of the proviso. That is, engage in open and free competition without deception or fraud, regardless of the rules of the game. In other words, I believe that the proviso, or at least this part of it, should go from being a proviso to being the center of what is indeed the social responsibility of business. These are moral precepts referencing people's fundamental rights. Businesses have the same social responsibility as all others in society, no more, no less. That is, to respect the rights of others, not to use force or fraud in their dealings with others. And so for business and to engage in open competition, which means you do not lobby the government for special tariffs and protection, or for special licensing laws, or for subsidies. All of those things are antisocial. They are contrary to all of our social obligations. And the fact that they are within the rules of the game and legal makes no difference. They are still immoral. So let me just conclude. So where does the pursuit of profits fit into this equation? Well, businesses and individuals will always pursue profits. Why? Because people are always interested in improving their well-being. To talk about it as a social responsibility is not particularly meaningful, I don't think. People are going to do it whether it's their social responsibility or not. But people will not automatically avoid using force or fraud in pursuing those profits. That has to be a conscious effort, especially if doing those things is within the rules of the game. It has to be inculcated into businesses' minds that these things are not ethical, that they are not moral, regardless of what the law says. The natural impulse is to try to earn profits, whatever the means. It is our responsibility to others to resist that impulse, to respect rights. So that's my talk. Thank you. Michael?
It seems to me that what business people argue now is that because of this way society has turned, that all of their social responsibility projects increase their profits. In other words, this is just part of their overall. If they didn't do it, two stores next to each other, store A does it, right? Store B doesn't do it, right? The store that does it gets more customers because people feel good when they
Right.
do it.
That's what this whole book is about.
Excuse me, John, for not reading the book.
John's book is a case study in that. He goes through lots of cases where the whole idea is that sometimes you just can't draw a clear line between what is altruistic, right, strictly altruistic, and what is just, you know, good business practice and actually leads to enhancing your profits. And John in his book goes through a lot of cases where he talks about just that, and so yeah, that's absolutely right. Yes?
Is social responsibility a corner that Marx wants to put capitalism in that you really shouldn't even be in?
I'm sorry, could you say it again?
For example, I have a problem with the term social responsibility.
Yeah, me too.
And I think it's a problem. I mean, it was probably contrived by Marx. My point
I
is
don't know.
that your only social responsibility as a company or business is not to extract more than you give. In other words, you mentioned subsidies and so on and so forth. So if businesses are going to be taking more than they give, such as getting tax breaks to come into North Carolina, and they're not providing the jobs that they're selling on, that's the burden. But they shouldn't have to, you know, be required to give more than run their own business.
Well, when you're dealing strictly on exchange, the free exchange without any of those things, that happens automatically, right? I mean, because both parties get more than they give, right? Sort of by definition, or at least expect to. I mean, people make mistakes. The product, it's not what they were anticipating, but ex ante, they exchange. Both expecting to get more than they're giving. That's why they make the exchange. It's when you go outside that realm that's violated. So I would argue that if you stick to what I'm saying is the social responsibility of business, and if they did that, that would automatically flow. And that's the point of Smith. I mean, that's what Smith was saying when he said people are led by an invisible hand to promote the interests of society as a whole, right? That they end up, in the eyes of the people they're trading with, giving up more than they're getting. Right? In their own eyes, it's the opposite. But yes, sir.
It seems to me you kind of jumped over Friedman's key point, which is businesses should be reflecting the will of their owners, and then you
I did.
And you jumped over that point, and then you also jumped over where you said, well, this is corporations' responsibility, it's people's. But I think more the point is, people have corporations is an artificial entity. People are actually the entity. And so if people behave morally, then the corporation just needs to reflect people, not the corporations have some different morality. So corporations can't have a morality. Corporations is just a collection of people.
That's exactly correct. And Friedman goes into that. I did jump over it just because I can't talk about everything. But yeah, what Friedman says is that the manager is directly responsible to the shareholders. And the shareholders essentially are the corporation. And unless the shareholders convey to the manager that he wants them to give a lot of money to cancer research instead of them taking it as dividends, unless they do that, then his primary assumption should be that they want higher returns on their investment rather than giving up some of those returns in order to make contributions to this, that, or the other thing. And Smith and Friedman also says, look, if they wanted that, they could have just waited and gotten their returns and then given it themselves. So what Friedman says is that what the manager is doing is he's substituting his views for the views of his shareholders and his morality and his ethic. In fact, and I disagree with Friedman on this, but he calls it a tax. That corporate social responsibility giving is a tax on shareholders. He then goes on to, he says it's a tax, but then he actually refutes why it isn't a tax. I mean, he sort of ends up saying, after going through a whole thing about why I skipped this in my talk, but after saying it's a tax and explain why it's a tax, because essentially he's extracting funds from his shareholders, he says, whether he wants to or not, he can't get away with spending stockholders or customers or employees' money. He said, will not the stockholders fire him? His customers and employees can desert him for other producers and employers less scrupulous. So that's why it's not a tax. Because when there's a tax, you can't do that, right? You're stuck. Yes, Max.
I want to ask a related question about the element of time horizons. If you and I, if we're two companies, say, engaged in an exchange of some sort, and there is so much value that can be captured by either of us, and I can push it's very hard, particularly if I'm in a strong market position, to gain a lot of that, to capture the most of that value and leave you with just a little bit, enough to make the exchange worth it, but risk engendering, not goodwill, something like that. So there's a sense in which, I guess what I'm saying is, maybe in the short term, if I behave that way, I am maximizing shareholder value and profits in the shorter term. But with a long-term view, I may want to pull back and let you capture more of that value. What do you think, and what do you think Friedman would think about these time horizons for profiting?
I mean, what I would think is that trade-off is just something that the business has to consider, and I do think that businesses tend to be far-sighted with respect to those things. I don't think most businesses are really short-sighted with respect to those things. So what you're saying is, I'm going to try to interpret you as saying, I can really push and get, for economists here, get as much of that consumer surplus for myself, right, as I want, but that's not going to look good from the outside, and I'm in a sense screwing my customer and so on, and I'm going to take that into consideration in a long-term sense for the long-term health of my business, and to make sure that realizing that every single exchange isn't the last exchange. I would think Friedman would say the same thing. I don't know why not. I mean, do you think he'd say something different?
I think you're probably right.
John?
Should have been edited better, and yet it's very famous. I think it's famous because of its title, its headline. Its headline grabs your attention.
Right.
Just like you said, once you read it, you're not quite sure the headline fits it entirely, but it tells us something about how marketing works and how you get people's impression. You make an impression on people by your headline, your first paragraph. You may spend the next 80 paragraphs sort of contradicting or clarifying or making it more elaborate, and people will only remember, I remember Friedman wrote that article about how the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits, because that's what they remember.
Right.
But anyway, two things. One of them is, I think you're absolutely right to underline in the questioner said, well, what's this deal about the real responsibility of a manager is to advance the interest of the owner, which is usually economic, maximizing profit or something, but it doesn't have to be. And Friedman doesn't spend a whole lot of his time other than saying, well, if you want to give money away, just do that after you get your dividend. Why have a business store? But that's that's an obvious solution to that problem. But there are plenty of businesses in real life that are operated where the owners have goals other than profit, and profit is not the number one goal. I mean, I know some, I know you do too, people might own a restaurant, they don't make very much money on it, they really like to be eating their own food, it's like the idea of a restaurant, or like the community that they're in, having a bake shop or whatever.
Right.
There are plenty of
practically impossible to share lots of sort of ambiguous or non-numerical kind of aspirations. You can't kind of amalgamate all that into a rubric that a manager can use, so you end up defaulting to maximizing profit.
Right.
It's really the only reasonable way of doing it at a large scale, having lots of owners.
And if the business is pursuing other goals, I think shareholders will like those goals will gravitate. It'll work the other way around. It's not so much that the business checks in with the shareholders to see what they want. It's that they see Ben & Jerry's giving away a lot of money, and they say, gee, I like businesses acting like Ben & Jerry's do, and so I'm going to buy stock in Ben & Jerry's. That's why we have these social responsibility mutual funds. Yeah.
Absolutely, and there are plenty of funds
Right.
like that, and they always claim that they're not going to rely on this. They're going to claim that by investing in only good things, we will actually make more money.
More money, yeah.
That's fallacious. It doesn't actually happen in real life. If you didn't invest in tobacco stocks at a certain point, your portfolio suffered versus the market average. So that their marketing path is just path, it's propaganda. But in a free society, you get to choose to do that.
Right.
And I think Friedman would have, even a couple of paragraphs of additional explanation of that.
I
would have been
agree.
helpful. The other bigger problem is this whole identification of owners and shareholders. I think in some ways it mixes people up a little bit more than it should. Because as a practical matter, a shareholder isn't an owner in the way that people are used to thinking about owning something. So I own my house. I can go in and out of my house. I can keep people coming into my house. I can sell my house. I can do all sorts of things. A shareholder is an owner of a stock. It's not the owner of a company. It's actually important psychological. A shareholder, if you buy 100 shares of Coca-Cola, you cannot go walk into the building and tell people what to do and all that sort of thing.
And walk out with a case of Coca-Cola.
Honestly, that almost seems like, well, who cares?
It's not an owner in that sense, right? It's
The problem is that a lot of these
Principal
political
agent.
activists actually don't distinguish between the two. That if they get a few people who own some stock, they have the right to tell the company this and that, come on with property. I'm an owner of this thing.
yeah.
And the truth of the matter is that as the questioner said earlier, corporations are not things anyway. They're really conceptual, abstract concepts. They're bundles of contracts among thousands or millions of people. They're not one thing. They're not just a corporate charter in Delaware. They're a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of agreements. The John Locke Foundation is actually not one thing. It's a series of contractual arrangements between the people who give the money and the people who spend the money, employees and management and vendors, the people who sell our lunches and the people. And so thinking about it as a set of contractual relations, I think actually helps your argument even more, because instead of thinking about it, I'm an owner, I get to have all these different things I could do with my business and so forth. What it really is I have given you some money to invest in this company, and you owe me certain things based upon that contract.
Yeah, and I think Friedman, he never really, look, all told, he wrote about 8 pages on this subject. Amazingly. That's it, 8 pages in 2 different places. And a lot of it is just repeated what he said. So there's all kinds of areas where he could have fleshed this out and never really did. But, so, Rick.
Yeah, you're both dealing with this business of the stockholders being in agreement on the goal. And if they're going to be agreeing on a goal, the typical thing is profit, because then they can do afterwards what they want.
Mm-hmm.
There is a whole category, of course, consistent with what you're saying, but there's a whole category of not-for-profit corporations where the shareholders are agreed upon a different,
Right.
not profit goal, but they nonetheless have agreed that the work in this particular situation will be for a cause.
Right. In fact, Friedman actually addresses that in the 70 article. He actually goes into that and says, unless it's what you just described, and then there's a legitimate reason not to pursue profit, but you're still acting in the interest of your shareholders.
The interest of shareholders and it's concerted interest, and they're in concert on that interest.
Right. Right. Yes, sir.
I can only go from my own personal experience. Those are great guidelines, but if you have a sales and marketing company and and you have a conservative, what we call bean counters, someone comes out of the accounting industry, he's running a sales and marketing company, and then you have an individual who's got a sales background with a creative mind, that company's success is totally different. And I was involved in that. For the person with a creative mind, operates and makes decisions totally different than a person who both of them can be fine people. But when a person comes out of a conservative background, they operate the company and the sales marketing company totally different.
I think,
Big difference in the sales.
yeah, it's the difference between an entrepreneur and a manager. I think you're right. And in order for a business to grow and to really be successful, it needs the entrepreneur and not be static. Yeah, George.
Profit has a bad name now, but Samuel Gompers, the great labor leader, said the worst thing for labor is a business which does not make a profit.
Sure. I can't disagree with that. Business doesn't make profit. That ultimately ends up with no employees.
Unless you get bailed.
Unless you, yeah, unless you're GM.
GM.
Right, unless you rent seek. Yeah, Darren.
Boy, one of the biggest challenges for me when I teach this topic on business law class is, okay, certainly businesses have the obligation to maximize profit, but there's also a desire, I think, from my perspective, that they should do more, and I think you talked about that, some of the ethical obligations of not violating individual rights, not seeking out subsidies, but it becomes very difficult to kind of define what that extra ethical behavior should be for businesses. Let me give you an example where we may be talking about businesses not lobbying to try to seek subsidies for themselves. What about like an exception from a regulatory obligation across multiple industries, and one industry seeks out an exception just for itself?
Just for himself.
Is it appropriate?
I think it's appropriate for the business to seek it out. I'm not so sure it's appropriate for, I mean, maybe in seeking it out, in the process, it ends up getting loosened for everybody. So I mean, I think that's a possible outcome. I think the problem is that you have governments that use regulatory regimes as a way to subsidize. In other words, or the same with taxes, right? You have a very high tax, and then you use the tax break to essentially centrally plan the economy. Ridge law is the great example, and maybe that's what you're thinking of, right? North Carolina's Ridge law, where it says you can't build tall buildings on your own property that happens to be on the top of a mountain in western North Carolina. And of course, the wind people are trying to get an exception for themselves. Now, I can understand why they're trying to do that. And what we've argued, of course, is we think there should be an exception for everyone. Let people put on their own property whatever they want, so long as even if it happens to be on top of a mountain. So, Mitch.
So, boy, in the 1970 piece you mentioned, the headline doesn't really have a whole lot to do with what
Right.
you actually wrote. Given the back and forth among economists, did you find any evidence that people who were of a different philosophical bent capitalized on that? Did people say, well, what are you talking about? Was there a lot of writing about how Friedman doesn't make his case?
I'm personally not really steeped in the journal literature that arose from this. And so I really can't answer that question. Let me just say, Friedman's view never took off. But one thing that was mentioned, and I will attest to this, out of this original article that came out, maybe I forgot to discuss it in here, but there was original article that Hood references, original book rather, by what was his name, Bowen? Anyway, 1953 book that sort of got this whole thing started. Was that his name, John? Bowen? 1953 book called Business and Society, maybe? Anyway, it started this whole social responsibility thing, and it launched in MBA programs all over the country a course called Business and Society. And luckily, where I went to school at the University of Hartford for my master's, it was the capstone course in the MBA program, but it was also an econ course taught by probably the only place in the world where this was done, because Business and Society courses essentially became courses for the promulgation of this social responsibility view. At the University of Hartford, it was taught by Dominic Armentano. For those of you who know, he's a hardcore libertarian, Randian at the time. And so I got a very different perspective on the social responsibility of business than most people who took Business and Society courses. But the point I was trying to make is that, you know, there was a lot of debate with Friedman surrounding this article. Friedman didn't, I don't think, really engage in the debate a whole lot. Other people did. But the fact is that he lost. I mean, the courses all now, there's business schools, schools of management. They may mention Friedman's view, but it's not dominant. What is dominant is still the Marxian view of social responsibility of business. And in business schools, that's what's taught. Profits in business schools are something that are kind of evil, interestingly. So anyway, should I end, Corey? Okay. Thank you very much.